Hi, all. Welcome to week 2 of Detective Fiction. Congratulations on getting through the first week. I've really enjoyed your posts about Christie and Conan Doyle. They're wild stories with a lot to talk about and write about. I hope you're finding. We'll do a little intro for hardboiled detective fiction today and talk a little bit about the midterm. If you have questions on that, you can feel free to email me. Let's see if I need to. Yeah, pull up the thing for that. So as you're thinking for your midterm tomorrow, you should try to focus on like narrowing your topic down to something really specific. You only have 2 pages to write, so you want to pick something really specific that interested you, intrigued you, outraged you, irritated you. Anything that sort of provoked a reaction is usually a good subject for a close reading. And it's called a close reading because you're looking very closely at a very small part. So you might pick a few examples of dialogue to look at. You might pick some representations of detectives or of potential villains or how misdirection is handled in the text. So you want to focus on something very short. You want to quote the stories that you're analyzing. So you want to have the page numbers ready. You don't have to do a bibliography. I know the works that you're working from. But it's fine to just quote and then in parentheses, put the page number where you found the quote from. And anything you quote, you want to explain why you're quoting that to me, why you're letting me know that this is an interesting part of the story to look at. Trying to think if there's anything else I can tell you to help you sort of zero in on a successful strategy there. I will say college is your opportunity to break out of the 5-paragraph format. It works really well when you're trying to write in a timed way for a test that you have to sit down and write and get out of there. But for something that you've put some thought into, it usually doesn't serve you as well. The better way to think about it is consider how each paragraph, however many you have, and it might only be 2, in a 2-page, you might have an intro and 2 paragraphs and a conclusion. That's actually pretty common for 2 pages. You don't have a lot of space to do more than that. You want each paragraph to kind of address a question that you've proposed for the reader. So one question you might raise is Chandler's critique of Sherlock Holmes too harsh, right? And the golden era. And you want to argue that, yes, it is harsh because he's overlooked something. And so the first paragraph might answer the question, is it too harsh? And your opinion is, yes, it is. Or no, it isn't. And then the second paragraph is, what is the thing that Chandler has overlooked that makes his opinion too harsh? Or what is the thing that he's gotten exactly right that makes his opinion correct? So you're really sharing your opinions. You're making your claim about your opinions on the pieces. And the conclusion is a place where a lot of students get trapped in just kind of restating what they've already said, which is pretty common in a 5-paragraph essay. You want to try to avoid that as much as you can. There's a little bit of restating you probably can't avoid, that you're just kind of recapping in a sentence or two that your opinion that you stated in the beginning, that then you spent paragraphs proving with evidence from the text. What you want your conclusion to do is let me, as your reader, know what are the broader implications of the argument you just made. So if you tell me that Chandler's critique of golden era detective fiction is incorrect or it misses the mark, why is it important for me to know that? And why was it important for you to prove it? Sometimes with these papers, especially if you're talking about gender representation or race representation or sexual orientation representation, like the implications are about society and how society needs to change and is failing. Those are important implications. Sometimes it's about the impact on the reader, right? Which can be important personally. It might not be important for society, but maybe you agree with Chandler's critique and you think that having an orangutan as the murderer is outlandish and unlikely, improbable, and it breaks your ability to suspend your disbelief long enough to stay with the story. If you think a story is going to do that, if you start to get the sense that a story is going to have an outlandish solution, then you're no longer invested in the story. And then the implication is that Chandler's correct. When it fails that realism test, you can't take it seriously any longer. It becomes something different. And that's a matter of personal taste, right? Some people like to read to escape reality. They're not interested in it being realistic. Some people like to read fiction that helps them understand and critique reality. And so it needs that element there. So there's not a right, Chandler's not right or wrong. He has a strong opinion and he gave us some evidence for it. And I hope it was a little provocative. Like, I love classical era detective fiction. I also love hard-boiled fiction. I can still recognize that some of the solutions to classical era puzzles are outlandish, right? But that just means that as a viewer or as a reader, I go to those texts for specific kinds of things. And so my paper might detail that, right? That they're not right or wrong. They're just different. They're serving different purposes. I don't know if that helps at all, but if you get stuck as you're trying to make your claim, and you do want to make a claim, even if it's a small claim, right? Like what interests you or engages you as a reader, or a big claim, like society does not respect women in roles of power and authority, right? And we see that in the fictions that we read. Or stereotypes get used to misdirect the reader and have them blame people who are not at fault and without evidence, right? Those are big implications. Whether you have a small implication or a big implication, you're making a claim about what you've observed as a reader of detective fiction, and then you are demonstrating with evidence from the text where you observed it, and then you're stating in the conclusion why you think it's important to know that. And if you get stuck as you're trying to do that, email me and I'll try to get you unstuck. And with that, let's talk just a little bit about this week coming up, which you kind of already started. I will say right here, this is the MLA heading. It only goes on the front page. It's your name, my name, the class, English 200, and the date that you wrote the paper. And don't neglect the title. Come up with a good title, not just detective stories. You know, I believe in you. You can do it. You got this. And you've got your topics here, right? To choose a moment, really narrow your focus, developing your understanding of detective fiction and its function, right? And you can take it to the writing center. You can have your friends read it or your family read it and tell them what they think about it. All of those things are good to do. Let's see. And as you've read The Simple Art of Murder from Chandler, you've already kind of gotten your crash course introduction to the hard-boiled era. So hard-boiled detective fiction rose to prominence in the 1930s to 50s in the wake of World War I and Prohibition. Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, who you've read, both of those you'll read, and Mickey Spillane created some of the most memorable hard-boiled detectives, and these characters often carried a cynicism about the world rooted in the moral ambiguities of war and the cycle of violence perpetuated by Prohibition-era organized crime and policing. So this idea where the police are sort of just rival gangs to the criminal, to organized criminals, springs up really pretty strongly in this. But prior to that, we get more police that are just sort of bumbling and they don't have forensic tools to solve crimes. They really rely on confessions. But now we've got forensic tools. We're looking for evidence. Detective fiction has actually changed the way policing happens, which is very interesting and odd. But we're in this post-war period, this interwar and then post-war period, where people are just really wondering whether or not society can continue, right? In any way like it did before. Dashiell Hammett, who wrote The House on Turk Street that you'll read, worked as a private investigator for the Pinkerton Detective Agency in San Francisco, and that gave him firsthand experience to draw on in his fiction. And I think Raymond Chandler praises him for that, and you can see that in his work as well. Like classical era detective fiction, the setting often plays a major role. Urban settings like San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago dominate the literature. Streets you can get lost in, buildings that are empty, lots of places to hide and disappear. Whatever the setting, the hardboiled detective knows the territory well. He knows the locals, the usual suspects, and the authorities. Women play particular roles in most hard-boiled fiction, either as the damsel in distress or as a dangerous dame, and sometimes both. They cause major problems for the detective, sometimes deliberately and sometimes accidentally. And this is the beautiful Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity. I can highly recommend. MacGuffins become popular and misdirection continues to be part of the detective game. MacGuffin is a term for an object or device that just furthers the plot. It doesn't really have any meaning to the story. In hard-boiled fiction, the MacGuffin often serves as a red herring, a distraction, something that directs attention away from the real problem of the story. And I'm going to go ahead and spoil this movie made in the 1940s that marks the beginning of film noir, where the Maltese Falcon is this prize that everybody's trying to locate. It's been stolen. It's missing. Where is it? Who has it? And it turns out that it's just a plaster statue that's been painted black. It's not a thing of great value. And the detective story is more about the interpersonal dynamics of all the people chasing it. So it's pretty common in detective fiction to have something like that that starts the story off, that kicks it off, that obsesses everybody, but it turns out not to be very important in the end. What's important is the dynamics between the characters. The hard-boiled detective has a gritty quality to him that sometimes pushes him into anti-hero territory. The genre goes back and forth between detectives who adhere to a strong personal moral code, though not always a legal one, and we've seen that a little bit in the classical era too, so there's some crossover. And detectives whose actions make them complicit in the very crimes they're fighting. What distinguishes this latter type from a straight-up villain is a commitment to justice in some form. So if you've seen the 1982 movie Blade Runner, that's a great example of a film version of a hard-boiled detective. It's considered part of the neo-noir tradition, and there's some overlap. You'll watch a video next week about film noir and hard-boiled detective, or read a little piece about it that kind of helps map out those subtle differences. It's got a very strong, kind of dark, morally gray aesthetic to it. And Raymond Chandler talks about this, right? An honest but not an innocent man, a good enough man that you would trust to solve your problems, but not so good that he's unbelievable or unrealistic. So the hard-boiled era springs up in the interwar period between the 20s and 40s. It can have a cynical tone. Though it can have a cynical tone, it's often characterized by the search for personal integrity in a morally compromised world. So hard-boiled fiction asks us to consider what justice means when society is fundamentally unjust. In this class, we'll read 3 variations on the hard-boiled detective. We'll read Dashiell Hammett's Continental Op, the Continental Operative. In that whole collection of short stories, we never learn his name. He's just a detective on the streets. He gives lots of fake names throughout all the stories. We never know what his real name is. Walter Mosley's Easy Rawlins. He's an African-American detective. When you read that story, pay close attention to the moments that diverge and tell his backstory. Easy Rawlins is a character who was a veteran in World War II, who was a child at the time of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And it's worth looking up what that is when he talks about what happens to his parents and how he lost them. And who has a strong sense of community. He's a very different kind of detective from the other ones that we've seen. And I'm going to ask you to think about why that is and how that might be connected to his racial identity and in the community he belongs to. And then Philip Dick's Detective Anderton. You might know, I mean, we're reading Minority Report. They have made a movie of that with Tom Cruise, which is excellent, and I can highly recommend it. The movie is different, and that could be a good final project if somebody wanted to watch the Minority Report and read the story and try to talk about what those changes reflect about our society as opposed to maybe what Philip Dick was thinking. So as you read these detectives, consider how these different detectives allow us to grapple with different concerns related to truth, justice, and the hard-boiled detective's role in bringing them forward. And that's all I've got for you today. Good luck on your midterms. Email me or text me if you have questions. I'm happy to help. I'm going to open the window for submissions through the weekend for discussion 3, because some of you were emailing saying you might need the weekend because of work commitments and things like that, which is totally fine. I understand it, but you do want to get all of the work before the midterm in by the end of this weekend, because next week's going to go fast and then we're going to be done. On the Padlet posts, please put your name on it. Sometimes Padlet will catch your name if you happen to have an account. You don't have to set up an account, but you do need to put your name on it because otherwise I don't know who you are. So if you're missing a grade for a Padlet and you're wondering if I'm ever going to grade them, I try to keep on top of the grades every day and grade things as they come in. And if your grade is missing for the Padlet, it's possible that I will figure it out. So have a great week and let me know if you have questions. Thanks.